Welcome, friend, to this serene moment where we slowly uncover the layers of history. This evening, our narrative unfolds in a realm distinct from ours, yet still deeply human. Whether you're drifting off to sleep or simply seeking to unwind, I appreciate your presence. I'd be thrilled to know where you are tuning in from, city or country, and what time it is as you hit play. It never ceases to fascinate me how history has the power to unite strangers. If this soothing style of historical storytelling resonates with you, think about subscribing. We have numerous tales to ease us into the calm of night. The reality of medieval street vendors was starkly severe, far beyond what we can comprehend today. They weren't the cheerful market sellers of idealized narratives, but rather desperate individuals grasping at the very lowest levels of society. Their daily existence was a matter of living hand to mouth, facing uncertainty each day about whether they would make enough to buy their next meal. Their lives were insecure, their earnings scant, and their social standing barely above that of beggars. Thomas begins his day before dawn just as he has for the last 15 years. His modest bakery, if it could even be deemed such, is little more than a rudimentary stone oven embedded in the wall of his one-room home. This space functions as both his workshop and living area, shared with his wife, Agnes, and their 3 surviving children. 2 other children did not survive past their second year, victims of the illnesses and malnutrition that claimed so many young lives during this harsh era. The bread Thomas carries is rough and dark, crafted from a blend of rye, barley, and any other grains he can afford. When times are especially tough, which is often the case, he thins his scant flour supply with additives that would horrify today's consumers. Ground acorns, sawdust, and even chalk make their way into his dough, not from ill intent, but from desperate necessity. These adulterants serve to increase the bulk of his loaves, enabling him to sell more bread and hopefully gather enough funds to purchase ingredients for the next day's batch. The streets that Thomas traverses are perilous obstacle courses filled with mud, refugees, and human waste. Unlike today, medieval towns lacked any organized waste collection or sewage systems. Residents indiscriminately discarded their refuse into the streets, which then combined with animal excrement from horses, pigs, and chickens cohabiting the urban environment. When it rained, as it frequently did in the damp climate of northern Europe, these thoroughfares transformed into filthy rivers that could rise to a person's ankles. As Thomas completes his rounds, he finds himself in competition with numerous other vendors, all vying for the attention of potential buyers. The rivalry is intense and can escalate to violence. Vendors fiercely protect their regular clientele, and selling locations and arguments over territory can swiftly turn into physical altercations. The frail and elderly are often shoved aside by younger, more vigorous competitors, relegated to less desirable spots where pedestrian traffic is scarce. Authorities provide little in the way of protection for these modest merchants. In fact, they are often regarded as a nuisance by city officials who perceive street vendors as contributors to the disorder and chaos of urban life. Regulations are plentiful and ever-changing, aimed more at extracting fees and penalties than at providing any real structure or safeguard. Thomas must adeptly maneuver through a perplexing array of regulations concerning where he can peddle his goods, what he can sell, and how much he can charge. The guild system, which offered some degree of protection and rules for established craftsmen, extended no such benefits to street vendors. These merchants operated outside the formal economy, lacking the support of powerful organizations or wealthy benefactors. They were genuinely on their own, exposed to the whims of consumers, rival vendors, and authorities alike. Agnes, the wife of Thomas, plays an essential role in their family's survival. While Thomas peddles bread throughout the streets, she takes care of their modest herb garden situated behind their home, cultivating whatever vegetables can endure the challenging soil and unforgiving climate. She also looks after a few thin chickens, but the eggs they lay are too precious to consume and must be sold to support the family's limited income. In the evenings, Agnes spins wool by candlelight, producing thread that she can trade with cloth merchants for a handful of valuable coins. The couple's children begin contributing to the household almost as soon as they are able to walk. The eldest, a 10-year-old boy named Edmund, helps his father transport bread through the streets, while acting as a lookout for any potential thieves or competing rivals. The two younger sisters assist their mother with the garden and the chickens, spending their days gathering bits of wood and dried dung for fuel. Education remains a far-off dream for children in their situation. Reading and writing are privileges of the affluent and the clergy, leaving Thomas and Agnes completely illiterate. They conduct their transactions through spoken agreements and trust, lacking written contracts or records to shield them from dishonest customers or suppliers. The seasonal fluctuations of medieval life introduce yet another hurdle for street vendors. Summer offers longer days and increased selling opportunities, but it also brings with it searing heat that can spoil bread quickly. Thomas must carefully time his sales, knowing that unsold bread loses its value within hours of being baked. The winter months present different obstacles, with shorter days limiting the time available for selling and biting cold, making it nearly impossible to remain outside for long stretches. During the harvest season, the streets become crowded with farmers bringing their produce to market, creating both opportunities and fierce competition for urban vendors. Thomas may find the opportunity to procure grain straight from farmers at marginally lower prices, yet he faces stiff competition from established bakers and affluent merchants who possess the resources to purchase in much larger volumes. Religious festivals and market days draw in throngs of prospective customers, but they also bring in vendors from nearby villages and towns, inundating the market with rivals. On these bustling days, Thomas could potentially make enough to adequately sustain his family for several days. However, such fortunate events are infrequent and unpredictable. The persistent risk of theft looms over every street vendor, as thieves target them not just for their goods but also for any coins they may have collected throughout the day. Thomas has become adept at concealing his money in various spots within his clothing and altering his routes to prevent criminals from predicting his movements. Over the past 5 years, he has fallen victim to theft 3 times, losing not only his daily earnings but also his complete supply of bread, resulting in his family facing hunger for extended periods. Additionally, illness remains an ever-present danger. The filthy conditions of medieval streets create ideal environments for diseases that can swiftly spread in crowded urban locales. Thomas has endured 2 significant plague outbreaks that ravaged his town, claiming the lives of many fellow vendors and customers. Each epidemic brings with it the dual specter of death and economic ruin, as people tend to shun the streets and markets perceived to harbor disease, often compromising the quality of ingredients available to street sellers like Thomas. Grain. Merchants regularly offload moldy or tainted products to smaller buyers who lack the bargaining power to insist on higher quality. Thomas has developed a habit of meticulously examining his purchases. However, even his trained eye may occasionally overlook signs of spoilage that only become evident after he has baked his bread and attempted to sell it. Storage also poses a considerable hurdle. Thomas's modest home offers scant defense against moisture, vermin, and pests that can swiftly ruin his valuable supplies. He has crafted rudimentary wooden containers to hold his flour and other essentials, but their protection is limited. Rodents are a persistent issue, not only consuming his ingredients, but also tainting them with their waste. The implements used by Thomas for his trade are simple and rudimentary compared to contemporary standards. His wooden tray, which he carved from a piece of driftwood he found by the river, functions as both a display and transport tool for his loaves. A small knife, carefully looked after and honed on stones, assists him in portioning loaves for customers who cannot afford to buy whole pieces. His meager earnings are kept in a worn leather pouch, while a piece of coarse fabric shields his bread from rain and dust. Weather significantly impacts Thomas's daily fortune or misfortune. Rain drives potential customers inside and can spoil his bread before he has the chance to sell it. Strong winds can scatter his goods, making it difficult to maintain his small display. Snow and ice exacerbate the already hazardous streets, reducing foot traffic to a mere trickle. Even in sunny weather, challenges arise as the heat can cause his bread to stale and become unappealing within hours. The dynamics between street vendors and their clients are intricate and often filled with tension. Many customers, who are often grappling with their own financial struggles, push hard for bargains, and regularly attempt to lower prices. They inspect the bread meticulously for any signs of spoilage or contamination, where any imperfection can lead to a sale being rejected and effort wasted. Credit is rarely offered, as both sides recognize that poverty complicates repayment. Thomas must also navigate the intricate social hierarchies of medieval society. When affluent customers approach, he must display the proper deference, removing his cap and addressing them with the appropriate titles. Failing to demonstrate adequate respect can lead not just to lost sales, but also to complaints directed at authorities, potentially resulting in fines or other penalties. Simultaneously, he must be sufficiently assertive to safeguard his interests and guarantee that he receives appropriate compensation for his products. Unfortunately, the legal framework provides scant protection for street vendors embroiled in disputes with customers or competitors. Legal decisions typically favor those with financial means and social influence, meaning a struggling baker's testimony holds little influence against that of a successful merchant or minor noble. Thomas has made it a point to steer clear of legal disputes whenever feasible, even when he is clearly wronged, as the costs and risks involved in seeking justice far exceed any possible gains. Seasonal celebrations and religious observances present vendors with both prospects and hurdles. Although these occasions attract throngs of potential buyers with disposable income, they also bring in extra competitors from different towns and villages. Authorities frequently impose special levies and fees during these events, cutting into already slim profit margins. Moreover, religious restrictions regarding specific types of labor or trade during holy days can further constrain selling opportunities. The physical demands of street vending are immense. Thomas spends most of his day on his feet, traversing long distances over challenging terrain while burdened with heavy loads. His back is perpetually in pain from leaning over his tray and lifting bags of flour. His hands exhibit persistent stains and cracks from kneading dough and working with rough materials. The relentless exposure to the elements has weathered his face and aged him prematurely, making him appear older than his 35 years. Sleep often eludes Thomas and his family. Their tiny home provides scant protection from the cold, noise, and various unpleasant odors that permeate medieval urban life. The straw they use for bedding is teeming with fleas and other pests, making it hard to find rest. Thomas often lies awake many nights, preoccupied with thoughts about the next day's sales, as he mentally tallies how much bread he can bake with the ingredients he has left and whether it will generate enough income to buy supplies for the next day. The solitude faced by street vendors adds another layer to their difficulties. Their low standing in society leaves them with few friends or supporters among the more established community members. Other vendors compete rather than act as allies, and customers tend to regard them with suspicion and, frequently, disdain. Although the clergy advocate for charity and kindness, they seldom provide genuine friendship or assistance for those they perceive as beneath them. In spite of these numerous obstacles, Thomas persists in his daily fight, as he sees no other options available to him. He lacks the funds necessary to open a proper bakery, the networks to join a guild, or the education to venture into different trades. Street vending, as tough as it may be, stands as his sole means of survival in a world that presents few chances for upward mobility. Each morning he rises before dawn, ignites his oven and starts the process anew, motivated by the basic human instinct to care for his family and preserve a semblance of dignity in an undignified environment. The narrative of Thomas the Baker exemplifies one of the countless street vendors laboring to survive in medieval Europe. From fishmongers selling their catches in coastal towns to cloth merchants vending their products in mountain villages, these modest traders constituted the backbone of medieval commerce, while enduring extraordinary difficulties and uncertainty. Their experiences shed light on the harsh truths of everyday life for the vast majority of individuals during a time often idealized in popular culture, yet was, in reality, merciless for those at the lower end of society's hierarchy. According to the reference materials provided, we move on to the second part of the difficult lives led by medieval street vendors. The challenges these vendors faced were not limited to simply making sales. Disease lurked within the bustling marketplaces like an unseen attacker, poised to ensnare the unsuspecting. The air was saturated with illness. In the narrow, twisting lanes where vendors showcased their goods, refuse accumulated in putrid piles between cobblestones. Human waste flowed freely through rudimentary gutters, mixing with animal droppings and decaying food scraps, creating a toxic mixture that fostered sickness. Vendors like Margaret the fishmonger toiled from dawn till dusk, surrounded by the foul odor of rot. Her humble stall, crammed between a blacksmith's forge and a tanner's workshop, displayed fish that had begun to spoil under the summer heat. Lacking refrigeration, Margaret waged a losing battle against time. The cod and herring she procured at sunrise would become increasingly foul as the day progressed, their scales dulling and flesh softening under the relentless sun. Each morning, Margaret would assess her leftover inventory from the day before, carefully cutting away the worst of the decay and placing the least spoiled specimens at the forefront of her display. The skill of selling less than fresh fish necessitated a delicate equilibrium between honesty and survival. Being too candid about quality could lead to starvation, while being too deceptive risked inciting the wrath of customers who might return, seeking compensation for their ruined meals. The spectre of contamination loomed over every sale. Flies swarmed the market stalls in dark clouds, indiscriminately landing on food, faces, and infected wounds. Rats scurried brazenly between the vendors' feet, growing plump on the constant supply of discarded scraps and spoiled items. These individuals unwittingly acted as harbingers of the Black Death and countless other illnesses that periodically surged through medieval cities like scythes through fields of wheat. Street vendors were exceedingly susceptible to these epidemics. Their work necessitated continuous interaction with the public, dealing with coins that had passed through numerous unwashed hands, inhaling air dense with the breath of the crowd. When plague hit a community, the marketplace often became the epicenter of its transmission. Vendors who managed to survive such outbreaks often found their clientele diminished, their already tenuous means of support hanging by an even frailer thread. The seasonal fluctuations of their trade added yet another layer of unpredictability to their lives. William, the fruit seller, understood that his fortunes fluctuated with the cycles of harvest and scarcity. Spring heralded the promise of fresh produce, but it also ushered in lean months when winter reserves ran low and new crops had not yet matured. In these dire times, William might find himself offering wizened apples and sprouting onions to customers whose wallets had become as thin as their frames. Summer brought abundance, but also intense competition. When orchards overflowed with fruit and gardens brimmed with vegetables, the market transformed into a battleground where vendors slashed prices in a desperate bid to sell their perishable goods. William watched in despair as perfectly ripe pears spoiled in his baskets, while customers haggled for pennies they could barely afford. Autumn signified the harvest rush, a frenzied time when vendors pushed themselves to exhaustion processing and preserving the year's yield. This was the moment when fortunes could be made or lost, where a successful season might generate enough coins to survive the impending winter, or where calamity could lead to starvation for an entire household. William dedicated these vital months to converting fresh fruit into dried products, opting for delayed profits over immediate sales for the harsh months that lay ahead. Winter was undeniably the toughest season of them all. With fresh produce but a distant memory, vendors like William were forced to rely on selling preserved items at steep prices to customers already strained financially. The cold pierced through. Their insufficient clothing, numbing fingers and turning the simple task of counting coins into a struggle. Snow and ice transformed the already hazardous streets into near impossible paths, reducing foot traffic to only the most desperate of buyers. The mental strain of such a life is significant. These vendors were enveloped in a constant state of anxiety, uncertain if the next day would bring fortune or failure, nourishment or starvation. Sleep was often elusive for those who spent their days teetering on the brink of survival. Nightmares were filled with images of empty stalls and disgruntled customers, unpaid debts and starving families. Perhaps the most demoralizing aspect was the total lack of a social safety net. When sickness struck, or injury made work impossible, or age rendered them incapable, there was no refuge. The guilds that shielded established artisans showed no concern for the welfare of humble street vendors. Though the church occasionally offered charity, it barely managed to nourish the throngs of impoverished individuals filling medieval cities. Family members often morphed into economic units rather than sources of comfort. Children were recruited into the workforce as soon as they could toddle, responsible for running errands, tending stalls, or watching for approaching authorities. Wives carried the dual burden of aiding with the family business, while managing homes with scarcely enough resources. The elderly, unable to contribute to the family's survival, became strains on already overstretched assets. The legal system provided no safeguards for these marginalized merchants. Courts were the domain of the affluent and influential, not the refuge for those selling items from carts and rudimentary stalls. When justice did manifest, it was often swift and merciless. A vendor accused of deceiving customers could find themselves placed in stocks, stripped of their goods and subjected to reputational ruin. The assumption of innocence was a privilege enjoyed only by those capable of affording legal assistance. Even death did not afford dignity to these overlooked individuals. Street vendors who succumbed to sickness, fatigue, or violence were frequently interred in unmarked graves, their deaths noted only by family members left to continue the struggle for existence. Their livelihoods dissipated without a trace. Their hard-earned knowledge of trade and survival perished with them. The winter of 1347 was especially brutal for the vendors in London's markets. Robert the grain seller observed helplessly as his clientele dwindled with each new day. The previous summer's harvest had been meager, and the grain that remained commanded prices that were accessible only to the wealthiest citizens. Robert found himself faced with the grim reality of needing to consume his own stock to stay alive, while simultaneously trying to preserve it to earn the income necessary for survival. As the cold intensified and snow began to fall more frequently, Robert began to notice changes in his remaining customers that filled him with despair. They moved sluggishly, their faces haggard, and their eyes empty with hunger. Some displayed the unmistakable signs of scurvy, with bleeding gums and loosening teeth from malnutrition. Others exhibited swollen limbs and distended abdomens, indicative of dropsy, as their bodies clung to fluid in a desperate bid to sustain life. Yet it was the sight of the children that utterly shattered Robert's heart. Young ones who should have been busy playing and laughing. Instead, they moved like aged spirits, their growth hampered by relentless hunger and their eyes reflecting a fatigue uncharacteristic of childhood. They grasped their parents' hands with urgent fervor, sensing that their grasp on life was just as fragile. The onset of spring offered no solace, merely different iterations of distress. The initial vessels arriving from distant shores carried more than just rare goods. Rats scurried down the mooring lines, their fleas laden with a plague that soon would be known as the Black Death. In mere weeks, the thriving marketplaces of medieval towns transformed into desolate channels where the living navigated carefully among the corpses. For those street vendors who managed to endure the early wave of the plague, the world that arose from the ruins was both a chance and a horror. With a significant number of deceased, the competition for customers plummeted sharply. Yet, these customers had turned into a source of grave anxiety. Each exchange came with the peril of infection. Every coin could carry the touch of demise. The societal fabric of medieval life, already frayed by ages of disparity and struggle, began to unravel entirely. Street vendors found themselves among the few daring enough to enter the plague-stricken neighborhoods, bringing food and necessities to those too frightened or unwell to venture out. This crucial service came at an appalling price, as vendor after vendor fell victim to the very disease they courageously faced. Those who survived did so through a blend of luck, isolation, and the relentless determination that had supported their class through countless tribulations. They had come to expect little from life beyond what they could forcibly extract through their own endeavors. In an existence where death could strike at any moment and justice was a privilege beyond reach, medieval street vendors cultivated a resilience that seemed almost extraordinary. Their influence endures, not in towering monuments or chronicled histories, but within the shared memory of hardship that flows through the veins of all who strive for their daily sustenance. They serve as a reminder that prosperity is tenuous, that safety often exists only in illusion, and that the thin line between order and disorder can hinge on a single unsuccessful harvest or the arrival of just one ship carrying disease. Through an exploration of their experiences, we not only witness the harsh truths of medieval life, but also the innate human ability to withstand, to aspire, and to persist in the vital act of living, despite the scant rewards that come with merely surviving another day. Drawing from the provided materials, let's delve into part 3 of the grim realities faced by medieval street vendors. As the sun rose over the cramped living conditions of medieval towns, a unique sort of desperation emerged among those who lacked access to arable land or workshops of their own. These were the street vendors, the most unstable of medieval workers, whose existence hinged on their capability to sell whatever limited goods they could accumulate in the narrow, filthy alleys of urban areas. Unlike the peasants tethered to their lords' lands or the artisans shielded by their guilds, street vendors operated in a shadowy realm of trade, functioning without the safety measures that others, however minimal, might have had. They were the economic outsiders, the desperate individuals who resorted to the streets when all other prospects were lost, carrying their entire means of livelihood in a wooden tray, a cloth bundle, or a rickety cart, which could collapse at any moment. Take, for instance, the situation of Margot, a widow whose spouse had died in one of the countless conflicts that ravaged the countryside. With no property to inherit and no male relatives to support her, she was thrust into the harsh realm of street trade. Every morning she awoke before the cathedral bells signaled the start of matins, gathering whatever meager scraps she could manage to buy from the wholesale traders who monopolized the city's food supply. This might include a few turnips that had seen better days, perhaps some barley turned down by bakers, or if luck was on her side, a small collection of eggs from hens no longer laying regularly. The math of street vending was brutally straightforward and completely unyielding. Margot could spend her last remaining copper coins to purchase goods at dawn, only to find that 3 other vendors had acquired the same items and were selling them at the same bustling intersection. Competition was not just intense, it was a matter of survival. Each customer who opted for her competitor's turnips over hers represented another step closer to starvation. The spaces where vendors could operate were extremely limited and fiercely protected. The prime locations near the cathedral entrance, in the market squares and at the gates welcoming travelers into the city, were dominated by established merchants who paid fees to the city powers for these lucrative positions. Street vendors were pushed to the fringes, literally forced to peddle their goods in the shadowy crevices of legitimate business. They gathered in the tight alleyways beneath the protruding upper stories of buildings or in the damp spots near the city walls, where the stench from the latrines was so strong that even the impoverished avoided lingering there. These marginal areas presented their own dangers. The gaps between buildings often became territories for cutthroats and thieves who regarded the vendors as easy prey. A street vendor carrying the day's earnings, however modest, could easily find themselves targeted by individuals even more impoverished than they were. The City Watch, when they deigned to venture into these dark corners, usually did so to extort bribes from the vendors rather than to offer any form of protection. The merchandise offered by street vendors painted a vivid picture of medieval, urban poverty, capturing it in a compact form. These vendors provided the discarded remnants and unsellable items that traditional merchants either couldn't or chose not to sell. Stale bread, unfit for a meal, could be marketed as trencher bread for those unable to afford freshly baked loaves. Vegetables nearing spoilage might attract desperate customers willing to trim off the bad spots and use the rest. Occasionally, vendors would buy offal, feet and other organs cast aside by butchers, simmering them into a broth that was then sold to laborers pressed for time and resources to prepare their meals. The seasonal fluctuations of medieval trade meant that street vendors often experienced dire financial hardship. During the cold winter months, when fresh fruits and vegetables were entirely absent and people stayed indoors, vendors could go days without seeing a single sale. Unlike peasants, who could retreat to their homes and survive on stored grains, or artisans who continued to work by candlelight in their shops, street vendors had no refuge from the financial turmoil that periodically ravaged medieval cities. Many vendors supplemented their paltry earnings by engaging in activities that lingered in the ambiguous spaces between lawful trade and outright illegality. They might act as informal couriers, passing along news and gossip among different areas of the city for a few coins. Others would serve as facilitators, assisting travelers in finding accommodation or services in exchange for a modest fee. Some even took to the surrounding countryside to collect wild herbs, mushrooms, or berries, selling these items to city dwellers lacking access to such resources. The dynamics between street vendors and the established merchant class were marked by an underlying tension. Guild merchants perceived street vendors as unfair challengers who slashed their prices and undermined the value of their meticulously regulated trades. They persistently petitioned city officials to impose restrictions on street selling, claiming that unauthorized vendors posed risks to public health and societal stability. These lobbying efforts often bore fruit, leading to recurring crackdowns, where city authorities would seize vendors' merchandise and impose fines that could devastate families already teetering on the brink of survival. Nevertheless, despite their official opposition, even guild merchants found practical uses for the vendor network. When a merchant had items that were slightly damaged or no longer at their freshest, selling them through street vendors provided a way to recover some value without tarnishing their own reputation. This resulted in a complex interrelationship, where vendors acted as an unofficial outlet for the excess and waste of the legitimate economy, while experiencing persecution from those very legitimate enterprises. The health risks confronted by street vendors were extraordinary, even by medieval standards. Enduring long hours outdoors left them exposed to all extremes of weather, from the sweltering heat of summer to the frigid chills of winter. The products they dealt with often had questionable quality from the outset, and the rudimentary preservation techniques of the time meant that vendors were regularly in contact with spoiled food and contaminated water. Many experienced chronic health problems stemming from their ongoing exposure to the elements and subpar provisions. Additionally, the social isolation faced by street vendors might have been as damaging as their economic instability. Unlike peasants who resided in tight-knit communities where everyone was familiar with each other, or craftspeople who were part of guilds providing both professional identity and social ties, street vendors existed on the fringes of urban life. They lacked the financial means to take part in the religious festivals and communal celebrations that connected neighborhoods, were too itinerant to build enduring connections, and were often too desperate to extend trust, even towards fellow sellers, who were essentially rivals for a small customer base. Children born to street vendor families faced particularly dire futures. From the moment they learned to walk, they were incorporated into the business, assisting their parents in selling merchandise, spending long hours exposed to the elements, holding baskets or calling out to possible customers. The prospect of education was completely out of reach, not only because their families were unable to afford it, but because every moment dedicated to learning letters or numbers was a moment lost in pursuing the coins that determined whether they would eat or go hungry. These children quickly understood that survival necessitated being vigilant for both opportunities and threats. They became adept at interpreting people's expressions and emotions, instantly discerning which potential buyers had money to spend, and which could potentially retaliate with harsh words or violence. Many honed their abilities as pickpockets and minor thieves, talents that their parents silently endorsed, despite outwardly disapproving. Aware that theft could sometimes be the thin line between their family's survival and starvation, the legal position of street vendors remained precarious. In extreme situations, they operated without official permits or recognition, rendering them vulnerable to customer deceit or theft by other vendors. When city courts were operational, they typically catered to the interests of established merchants and landowners. A street vendor attempting to lodge a complaint against a guild member or a noble would likely encounter countercharges of vagrancy or disturbing the peace. This legal precariousness rendered vendors susceptible to corruption and exploitation. City officials, both righteous and corrupt, frequently demanded bribes in exchange for permission to operate in specific areas or at particular times. These unofficial levies further diminished the already slim profit margins of vendors, but refusing to comply often resulted in being ousted from prime selling spots or having their merchandise seized under false pretenses. The spiritual lives of street vendors mirrored their marginalized social standing. While the medieval church advocated for charity and compassion towards the impoverished, vendors often found themselves alienated from the broader spiritual community. They struggled to meet the financial expectations of donations at religious services, couldn't afford the time for lengthy masses when each hour spent away from selling equated to lost revenue, and frequently felt unwelcome in places of worship, where established merchants and craftsmen expressed their disdain. Nevertheless, many vendors valued their faith, perhaps because it provided one of the scarce sources of hope in their otherwise grim circumstances. They cultivated their own informal religious customs, offering quick prayers over their goods, in hopes of attracting customers, crossing themselves with every sale, and calling upon various saints believed to safeguard merchants and traders. Some carried small religious tokens or amulets, convinced these would bring them luck or shield them from the numerous hazards of street life. The cycles of feast and famine, characteristic of medieval existence, struck street vendors particularly hard. During religious celebrations or market days, when the city was buzzing with visitors and pilgrims, vendors occasionally enjoyed short bursts of relative prosperity due to increased demand for their products. However, these peak periods were invariably followed by protracted times of sparse sales, compelling vendors to meticulously manage their earnings to endure the lean times. Yet, feast days also introduced their own set of difficulties. The heightened rivalry from transient vendors who swarmed the city during festival times meant that established street vendors frequently found themselves displaced from their traditional locations by newcomers who had better funding or superior connections. The irony was stark. The very events that were supposed to usher in prosperity often led to greater hardship, as the market became saturated with sellers vying for the limited coins of customers. Weather conditions posed another relentless adversary for street vendors. Rain could devastate perishable items in moments, while excessive heat could spoil food before it was even sold. Snow and ice rendered the already perilous city streets almost impassable, while strong winds might scatter light goods or snuff out the small flames that vendors used to prepare food. In contrast to merchants with fixed shops, vendors had no shelter for themselves or their products, leaving them entirely at the mercy of nature's unpredictability. The tools essential to the street vendor's craft were as modest as they were crucial. A wooden tray or basket, possibly accompanied by a small cart if they were lucky enough to afford one, some pieces of cloth to present goods or shield them from the weather, along with a leather pouch to store the scant few coins that made up their entire wealth. These basic tools represented significant investments for individuals living in dire poverty, and any loss or damage could result in catastrophic consequences. Many vendors had to rent even these fundamental implements, paying daily fees to more affluent individuals who possessed enough means to invest in such equipment. This arrangement confined vendors in a cycle of debt and reliance, with much of their daily income allocated toward tool rental, preventing them from saving the capital necessary to buy their own equipment and break free from the cycle. The web of relationships that supported street vendors was intricate and delicate. Vendors frequently formed informal partnerships with others, offering complementary products, trading insights about potential customer locations or which areas to steer clear of due to heightened enforcement. Yet, these connections were consistently strained by the fact that each vendor ultimately competed against all others for the same limited customer base. Some vendors focused on serving specific communities within the city. Those fluent in multiple languages might cater to foreign traders or travelers, whereas others honed their skills to meet the unique needs of various neighborhoods or professional groups. This specialization could afford some degree of protection from rivalry, but it also left vendors susceptible to fluctuations in their targeted market. The night hours presented distinct challenges for street vendors. As night descended and legitimate businesses closed, the streets became more perilous. Vendors who had not managed to sell their perishable items during the day faced the painful decision of either attempting to sell them at sharply reduced prices in the encroaching darkness, or acknowledging a complete loss. Many vendors spent their evenings moving door to door in less affluent neighborhoods, looking for customers who might buy day-old bread or slightly spoiled produce at lower prices. The unrelenting stress of this precarious lifestyle severely impacted the physical and mental well-being of street vendors. The combination of poor diet, exposure to the elements, and constant anxiety over where the next meal would come from resulted in a demographic that aged quickly and often succumbed to early death. Numerous vendors experienced chronic coughs from inhaling the polluted air of medieval cities, while others dealt with diseases related to malnutrition that drained their strength and muddied their judgment. Nevertheless, despite these numerous challenges, street vendors played a vital role in the medieval urban economy. They established a network for distributing goods that might otherwise go unsold. Catering to customers unable to pay the prices set by established vendors, they provided economic opportunities for individuals marginalized from the formal structures of medieval trade. In their unique way, they can be seen as forerunners of what we now term the informal economy, generating value and meeting demands through sheer willpower and creativity. The chronicles of individual vendors, when they do appear in historical records, highlight both the deep poverty and the astonishing resilience of these overlooked merchants. They tell stories of women who juggled raising children, alongside carrying baskets of goods on their heads. They recount the experiences of men who trekked miles each day in pursuit of customers for their products, and families who squeezed into single rooms with their stock, while valuing every copper coin as if it were gold. As the medieval period came to an end, and new commercial practices began to take shape, street vendors encountered both fresh challenges and opportunities. The expansion of towns alongside the growing complexity of trade networks opened new markets for their offerings, but also ushered in greater regulation and competition. Some vendors were able to accumulate sufficient resources to set up permanent storefronts or join guilds, while others were pushed further to the fringes as the formal economy grew and solidified. The influence of medieval street vendors persists today in the informal markets and street commerce that thrive in urban areas worldwide. Their experiences serve as a testament to the fact that, throughout history, there have always been individuals who have survived through their ingenuity and determination, crafting livelihoods from nothing but the bravery to stand on the streets and present their goods to those passing by. In their challenges and minor victories, we witness the enduring human spirit to survive and thrive, even when faced with seemingly insurmountable difficulties. Continuing from your summary and the reference materials, let's move forward from the conclusion of Part 3. The unending cycle of toil and scarcity that characterized the existence of medieval street vendors was made even more challenging by the ever-present threat of violence and theft that lay in wait within every dim alleyway and bustling market. In contrast to organized merchants who benefited from the backing of guilds and the safety of established storefronts, street vendors often found themselves in a precarious position, with their entire livelihoods packed into baskets and carts that could be upended or looted in a heartbeat. Take the example of Agnes, a fishmonger who awakened each day before dawn to procure her goods from the boats coming into the harbor. With just enough coins to afford a single day's catch, she had no alternative but to accept credit from fishermen, vowing to settle her debts once the sales were completed. This unstable arrangement left her doubly at risk. Should thieves pilfer her basket, or the fish spoil in the heat before she could sell them, Agnes would not only lose her day's earnings, but also find herself burdened with debts that could escalate beyond her capacity to repay. The medieval thoroughfares offered scant protection for such vulnerable vendors. City guards, if they existed, mostly focused on safeguarding the interests of established merchants and maintaining order in the primary market squares. The narrow, twisting lanes where street vendors typically peddled their goods were largely unregulated zones where strength dictated power. Groups of youths, desperate beggars, and minor criminals recognized that a solitary vendor with a cart full of merchandise represented an easy target. Acts of violence against street vendors came in many forms, from the swift theft of a few items to more structured raids that could obliterate an entire inventory. Certain criminals even specialized in targeting particular types of vendors. Street vendors selling bread, for example, were frequently robbed not only for the worth of their products, but also because bread could be consumed right away, providing sustenance for a starving thief or easily resold. Those offering small, high-value items like spices or metalwork constantly faced dangers from pickpockets and cutpurses, who could swiftly pinch valuable goods and vanish into the throng. The psychological burden of this constant alertness was immense. Street sellers cultivated an almost uncanny awareness of their environment, perpetually scanning the crowd for possible threats while striving to attract customers. They became adept at interpreting the subtle indicators that signaled trouble might be on the horizon. The movements of certain individuals, the formations of groups that could be coordinating a theft, and the times when criminal activity was most apt to occur. Many vendors devised intricate tactics to safeguard themselves and their merchandise. Some formed informal partnerships, watching over each other's stalls during short breaks, thus creating networks for mutual defense. Others resorted to getting guard dogs, though the cost of feeding an animal added another strain to their scarce resources. The more prosperous vendors might take on a young apprentice or a family member to act as both helper and protector, although this too came with considerable financial implications. The seasonal aspect of street vending posed further security challenges. On bustling market days or during religious celebrations, when sales opportunities were at their peak, the increased crowds also offered better cover for thieves and pickpockets. Vendors were trapped in a dreadful predicament. The very conditions that allowed for the most profit also presented the greatest danger of theft and violence. Female vendors encountered especially significant risks, as they were often perceived as easier targets for theft and assault. Women selling goods on the streets devised their own methods of protection, often opting for attire that disguised their gender or banding together in groups for added security. Some even carried concealed weapons, such as small knives or sharpened tools that could function both as trade instruments and as means of self-defense. The justice system provided minimal support for victims of street crime. Even when thieves were apprehended, the protracted and costly nature of legal proceedings was frequently beyond the financial reach of struggling street vendors. Courts typically leaned in favor of established merchants and guild members, leaving the testimony of a lowly street vendor unvalued in contrast to that of a respected citizen. This relentless threat of violence fostered an environment of fear and distrust that infiltrated every facet of street vendor life. Vendors were wary not just of obvious dangers, but also of customers who might be sizing up their goods for potential theft. The necessity to remain perpetually vigilant and defensive inevitably hindered their capacity to be warm and inviting to genuine buyers, establishing a vicious cycle that could jeopardize their business opportunities. The economic repercussions of crime against street vendors extended well beyond immediate losses of merchandise. A single significant theft could eradicate weeks or even months of accumulated profits, compelling vendors to resort to high-interest loans or sell personal belongings to replenish their stock. Some vendors faced the complete collapse of their businesses due to a series of thefts, joining the ranks of the impoverished unemployed who may have resorted to crime for survival. Weather conditions posed another relentless challenge for medieval street vendors, equally predictable and devastating. Unlike today's merchants who operate in climate-controlled spaces, street vendors were fully exposed to the whims of nature, witnessing their goods being ruined by rain, snow, wind, and intense temperatures, all while customers stayed away. Among these elements, rain posed the most immediate and common threat. A sudden downpour could spoil an entire day's supply of bread, dissolve meticulously prepared meals, and irreparably damage textiles. Vendors dealing in paper items, ready-made foods, or any moisture-sensitive products lived in a state of perpetual anxiety about the unpredictable weather. Many created intricate systems of coverings and shelters, yet these were frequently insufficient in the face of a severe storm. The seasonal patterns of medieval life brought times of both plenty and scarcity that street vendors had to skillfully navigate. Summer offered the prospect of fresh produce and heightened foot traffic, but also necessitated vigilance in preventing perishable items from spoiling due to the heat. Conversely, winter provided a break from decay, but introduced new challenges as frozen goods became unmarketable and potential buyers preferred to stay indoors. Snow and ice made conditions perilous for vendors transporting their wares and for customers attempting to make purchases. The narrow, unpaved roads of medieval towns turned into muddy bogs during wet weather and icy barriers in winter, severely complicating the already tough job of moving heavy carts and baskets. Intense heat created special difficulties for those selling food products. Lacking refrigeration, meat, dairy, and cooked dishes could spoil in mere hours on hot summer days. Vendors had to meticulously time their buying and selling, purchasing only what they could sell before items went bad. However, this limitation hindered their ability to leverage bulk purchase bargains or stock up during off-peak times. Wind could also pose a significant threat, toppling carefully organized displays, scattering lightweight merchandise, and making it nearly impossible to keep the neat and appealing setups that attracted customers. Vendors dealing with cloth or light goods were continually anxious about sudden gusts that could send their entire stock flying through the streets. The absence of sufficient shelter in most medieval towns meant that street vendors had little recourse when harsh weather conditions hit. Some larger marketplaces had covered sections, but these coveted locations were usually reserved for more established merchants willing to pay higher fees. Street vendors had to construct their own temporary shelters using whatever materials they could afford, like scraps of cloth, bits of wood, or animal hides that offered minimal defense against the elements. In spite of these daunting obstacles, medieval street vendors showcased impressive creativity and determination in their daily fight for survival. They cultivated extensive knowledge of their local markets, discerning which corners provided the best wind protection, what times of day attracted the most customers, and which items were most likely to sell in varying weather. Many vendors focused on products that were less vulnerable to weather-related damage or spoilage, even if those items yielded smaller profit margins. Others adapted by diversifying their range, carrying a combination of goods that could generate income regardless of the circumstances. Some established connections with indoor merchants, acting as informal suppliers when established shops were closed or lacking inventory. The social networks that street vendors formed with one another became vital survival strategies. Information about lucrative spots, hazardous zones, dependable suppliers, and fluctuating market dynamics circulated through these informal channels, aiding individual sellers in making informed choices regarding where to set up, what products to peddle, and when to recognize a loss and try again another day. These individuals, transporting their simple goods through the erratic streets of medieval towns, exemplified a unique form of bravery, born from necessity and fueled by optimism. They confronted each day aware that their very survival relied on the thinnest of margins, where a single unfortunate incident could lead them into dire poverty. Nonetheless, they remained determined to establish their presence within a relentless economic framework. Their narratives remind us that amid the grand tales of medieval history, the conflicts and territorial expansions, the ascension and decline of empires, the magnificent artistry and architecture, lie the silent struggles of common folk attempting to survive under circumstances that would challenge even the strongest among us. In their tenacity and flexibility, we observe the core human instinct to endure and flourish even when faced with overwhelming odds. The stark realities of medieval street vendors, Part 5. As we explore further into the harsh truths of medieval trade, we encounter perhaps the most exposed participants in this merciless economic environment: the street vendors. These vulnerable individuals represented the lowest tier of the medieval commercial spectrum, existing in a tenuous state between legitimate business and abject poverty. Their experiences shed light on the grim realities of survival in an era where a single misstep could mean the difference between minimal sustenance and severe hunger. The average medieval street vendor possessed little more than what they could carry on their person or stack onto a rickety handcart. Unlike established traders who enjoyed the safety of guild support and fixed storefronts, these itinerant sellers functioned entirely outside the formal economic systems that afforded some level of security to their more privileged counterparts. They were the economic outcasts, eking out a living by peddling society's discarded items to those with limited options. Imagine the sunrise over a typical medieval village. As church bells chime to announce the start of the day, a hunched figure emerges from whatever refuge they manage to find during the night, be it a doorframe, a stable, or, if luck smiled, upon them, a little nook in an inn's shared space acquired with their last copper coin. Meet Margot, a widow whose husband's passing has left her burdened with debt and a fierce resolve to persevere. Her calloused hands tightly grasp a woven basket that holds her entire stock. A few shriveled apples, salvaged from a merchant's refuse, heap, some dubious strips of dried meat with unclear origins, and several small clay containers filled with what she hopefully refers to as healing salve, though it's little more than rendered animal fat, blended with common herbs. Margot's plight reflects the dire situations that drove many into the realm of street vending. The loss of a breadwinner, the collapse of a small business, exclusion from a guild, or simply the misfortune of being born into challenging circumstances, could thrust anyone into such a hand-to-mouth lifestyle. For women like Margot, the loss of a spouse often meant a rapid descent into poverty. The medieval community offered few legitimate avenues for women to independently sustain themselves, and the options available were usually governed by male-dominated guilds that carefully protected their territory. The items these vendors traded narrate their own tales of desperation and ingenuity, illustrating that fresh produce was often out of their reach. Those vendors turned to established merchants who had the resources necessary to acquire quality goods and the facilities to store them properly. In contrast, street vendors often handled the leftover remnants of medieval trade. They sold the damaged fruit that regular merchants deemed unsaleable, the stale bread that bakers could not sell, and the questionable cuts of meat that butchers couldn't vouch for. They offered homemade potions of uncertain usefulness, rudimentary, trinkets made from leftover materials, and whatever minor services they could perform with their own abilities. The quality of these products was frequently as dubious as their sources. Lacking adequate storage or preservation techniques, much of what street vendors offered was in various degrees of deterioration. Fruits could be soft and on the brink of rotting, bread might be as hard as rock or teeming with mold, and meat often turned out to be spoiled or infested with maggots. Yet desperate buyers, compelled by their limited means, would still acquire these subpar products as they were often the only affordable options available. Competition amongst street vendors was intense and frequently ruthless. Operating outside the controlled guild framework, they had no designated territories or standards. Vendors would fiercely contest the most advantageous spots near church, entrances where worshippers congregated, outside taverns where money circulated more freely, or at the peripheries of established markets where they could attract overflow customers. These disputes could escalate into violence swiftly, with vendors resorting to any available means to safeguard their claims to lucrative locations. The dynamics between street vendors and established merchants were characterized by ongoing friction and mutual distrust. Guild merchants perceived these unregulated vendors as threats to their exclusive rights and profits. They raised their concerns with the authorities, claiming that street vendors unfairly underpriced their goods, sold substandard products that tarnished the reputation of all merchants, and drew in undesirable individuals to commercial zones. Many established merchants would go to great lengths to drive street vendors from what they viewed as their territory, occasionally hiring enforcers to intimidate or attack them. Local officials typically harbored the same disdain for street vendors as the established merchants. These unofficial traders did not pay taxes, lacked permits, and contributed nothing to the formal economic systems that towns relied on. They were viewed as parasites, living off the legitimate trade of rightful citizens. Town guards frequently targeted street vendors, seizing their products on trumped-up charges, demanding bribes to allow them to operate, or simply threatening them until they left. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life particularly impacted street vendors. During bitter winters, when travel became treacherous and disposable income was scarce, the already meager flow of potential customers shrank to nearly nothing. Vendors would seek any available shelter, gradually using up their remaining stock just to endure until spring brought new opportunities for trade. Many did not survive these harsh months, falling victim to the cold, starvation, or illness in anonymity, their deaths largely unrecorded. The specter of disease was ever present in the lives of street vendors, With poor nutrition, exposure to harsh conditions, and frequent handling of contaminated goods, they became prime candidates for the various illnesses that swept through medieval communities. A vendor who fell ill faced a dreadful dilemma: continue working while sick, risking the spread of illness that could deter customers, or take time to recuperate and watch their already scant income evaporate. Most opted to keep working, establishing a pattern where illness circulated through the vendor community and subsequently impacted their customers. The social isolation that street vendors endured was arguably as oppressive as their physical trials. The established society viewed them with skepticism and disdain, perceiving them as hardly better than beggars or lawbreakers. They were barred from attending religious services in more prestigious churches, denied access to reputable establishments, and shunned by those who occupied slightly higher rungs on the social ladder. This isolation was particularly harsh, since many vendors had once belonged to respectable society before unfortunate circumstances forced them onto the streets. Yet within this marginalized community, moments of camaraderie occasionally emerged. Vendors exchanged information on advantageous locations, alerted one another about unfriendly authorities, and sometimes pooled resources to support a colleague going through a particularly tough time. These informal networks served as the sole social safety net accessible to those who had slipped through every other crevice in medieval society. The inventory management issues that street vendors grappled with vastly differed from those faced by established merchants. Lacking permanent storage and operating with minimal funds, they had to meticulously manage their purchases to ensure they could sell everything before it spoiled entirely. A vendor might invest their last few coins in a questionable batch of fish, fully aware they had only hours to sell it before it became completely unfit for consumption. The pressure of these ongoing calculations, coupled with the physical strain of transporting goods through congested streets, took a serious toll on both their bodies and minds. Children born into vendor families encountered particularly bleak futures. From the moment they could walk, they were compelled to contribute as unpaid help, assisting in the carrying of goods, keeping an eye out for authorities, and attracting customers with their youthful innocence. The prospect of education was utterly beyond reach, as was any chance of an apprenticeship in a reputable trade. From a young age, these children came to understand the brutal realities of medieval trade. They honed the keen instincts and adaptable morality required to navigate a world that provided them with no genuine opportunities for improvement. The dynamic between street vendors and their clientele was intricate and laden with mutual distrust. Customers recognized they were purchasing subpar goods, but had little alternative due to their own limited means. They scrutinized each item, carefully bargaining fiercely over prices that were already barely viable for the vendors. Trust was nearly non-existent. Customers presumed vendors were attempting to deceive them, while vendors were aware that patrons would vanish the moment. They found better options elsewhere. Payment posed another ongoing obstacle, as many potential buyers lacked coins entirely, instead proposing to barter with equally dubious items or services. A vendor might exchange a tattered scrap of cloth for spoiled fruit, hoping to find someone else who valued the fabric more than the food. These intricate barter arrangements created their own set of complications, as vendors ended up with inventory they never intended to hold, and which they struggled to sell. The legal standing of street vendors was intentionally vague, exposing them to arbitrary enforcement and exploitation. Although not technically illegal in most areas, their activities existed in a gray zone that authorities could interpret as they saw fit to serve their interests at any given time. A vendor might operate without interference for weeks, only to suddenly face arrest on charges like vagrancy, theft, or disturbing the peace. The absence of clear legal protections meant that vendors had nowhere to turn if they were cheated, robbed, or assaulted by customers, rivals, or law enforcement. Weather was another constant adversary. Rain could ruin any products that lacked adequate protection, while intense heat would hasten spoilage and deter potential buyers. Snow and ice rendered travel perilous and significantly reduced foot traffic. Vendors needed to continuously adjust their approaches to account for circumstances beyond their influence. Often, this entailed abandoning lucrative locations simply because the weather rendered them impractical. The mental strain of this lifestyle cannot be emphasized enough. The relentless anxiety over unstable earnings, the stigma of social rejection, and the physical toll of their trade generated a relentless despair that even the most resilient individuals found hard to endure. Many merchants sought solace in alcohol or other substances to dull their suffering, which further undermined their capacity to operate effectively. It's likely that the suicide rate among these vendors was considerably high, although such incidents might have been classified under other causes or not recorded at all. In spite of these daunting obstacles, a number of street vendors managed to demonstrate remarkable fortitude and inventiveness. They devised clever techniques for preserving dubious goods, crafted persuasive sales arguments that could attract buyers even for less desirable items, and established networks of connections that enabled them to endure the most challenging times. A handful even succeeded in amassing sufficient funds to invest in more legitimate forms of business, although such success stories were rare and almost miraculous. The spiritual lives of street vendors were complex due to their societal position. Although Christianity professed that all souls held equal value in the eyes of God, the harsh reality often saw vendors marginalized from religious communities. They frequently lacked the means to provide the expected offerings for parishioners. Their irregular schedules made it hard to participate in services, and their ties to questionable goods left them unwelcome at respectable congregations. Numerous vendors crafted their unique folk religious customs, blending Christian beliefs with ancient traditions and superstitions that promised safety from the perils of their everyday lives. In exploring the grim realities endured by medieval street vendors, we witness a reflection of the broader injustices and hardships of their time. These desperate sellers were not criminals or idly seeking quick profits. They were individuals ensnared in situations beyond their influence, striving to survive within a system that provided no genuine alternatives. Their narratives serve as a reminder that behind every economic exchange in the medieval era lay human struggle, pain, and the relentless quest for dignity amidst dehumanizing conditions. The heritage of these overlooked tradespeople resonates throughout history, highlighting that commerce has always been influenced not solely by the grand plans of affluent traders and influential guilds, but also by the urgent innovations of those battling for survival on the fringes of society. In their ingenuity, tenacity, and refusal to concede defeat against overwhelming adversity, medieval street vendors encapsulated both the harshest elements of their time and the enduring human ability to withstand and adapt when confronted with insurmountable challenges. The Harsh Lives of Medieval Street Vendors, Part 6. As dawn broke and the mist cleared from the cobblestone paths, unveiling puddles of refuse and waste from the previous day, the street vendors of medieval towns initiated their familiar survival routines. They emerged from cramped living conditions, where entire families shared space on straw beds, cohabiting with rats and fleas that transmitted diseases from one household to another. The faces of the vendors bore the weathered signs of countless mornings spent in these unforgiving environments, their hands already stretching for the scant goods they hoped to sell before the sun reached its zenith. The sanitary conditions for medieval street vendors were utterly horrifying by contemporary standards. Open sewers traversed the narrow streets, carrying human waste, animal refuse, and the decomposing leftovers of unsold food directly past the places where vendors displayed their goods. The smell was unbearable, a thick fog of decay that clung to clothes and skin, so pervasive that vendors hardly noticed it anymore. This was simply the norm for them, a world where the ideas of hygiene and public health were still centuries from being understood. Water, that essential resource for survival, posed a difficult dilemma for vendors. The wells and rivers that supplied the towns were tainted with the same grime that flowed through the streets. Vendors seeking to clean their produce, their hands, or their basic tools had no option but to use this polluted water, unwittingly transmitting disease with every sale. Many vendors suffered from chronic digestive issues, skin ailments, and respiratory problems due to continual exposure to these unsanitary conditions. Yet they remained oblivious to the link between their environment and their worsening health. The very items they sold became conduits for illness in these unclean situations. Meat left exposed to the elements quickly attracted clouds of flies that had just feasted on human waste and decaying trash. Vegetables and grains soaked up moisture from the contaminated air, turning into breeding grounds for bacteria and mold. Dairy products curdled within hours under the summer sun. However, vendors had no alternative but to continue selling them, hoping to recover even a small portion of their investment before the food spoiled entirely. The absence of suitable food storage led to a relentless cycle of contamination and waste. Most vendors had only crude wooden boxes or woven baskets for safeguarding their goods, containers that provided minimal protection against rain, dirt, or pests. Rats and mice deemed vendor stalls their personal buffet, polluting far more food than they actually consumed. Just one rat could ruin a vendor's entire stock for the day by urinating on produce or gnawing through containers. Unfortunately, vendors had no viable pest control methods apart from rudimentary traps and an occasional cat. Personal hygiene. Among vendors was nearly non-existent, not by choice but due to circumstances. Most vendors possessed only a single set of clothing, which they wore consistently until it literally disintegrated. These garments accumulated grease, food remnants, sweat, and filth, creating ideal conditions for lice and other parasites. Bathing was a luxury few could indulge in, both in terms of time and financial means. Even if vendors could take the time to heat water and find privacy, soap was typically costly and often inaccessible to those in dire economic situations. The communal aspect of medieval sanitation hit vendors particularly hard. Public latrines, when they existed, were shared by hundreds and seldom cleaned. More often, individuals simply relieved themselves in alleys, against walls, or right in the streets. Vendors who spent their entire days in public spaces had little option but to attend to their most private matters in plain view of potential customers, adding to the numerous humiliations they faced daily. Illness spread among vendor communities with alarming speed and efficiency. When one vendor became afflicted with dysentery, typhoid, or any of the countless ailments flourishing in such environments, their close quarters with others in the marketplace guaranteed swift transmission. Sick vendors had no choice but to keep working. Missing even a single day of sales could spell starvation for their families. Thus, they persevered in their work even while unwell, coughing and sneezing over their products, handling their merchandise with hands quivering from fever, transferring illness to customers and fellow sellers alike. The sporadic eruptions of more severe diseases, such as the bubonic plague, wreaked havoc on vendor communities with unparalleled severity. The Black Death, which repeatedly swept across Europe throughout the medieval era, found perfect breeding grounds in the crowded, filthy markets where vendors assembled. This disease was transmitted by fleas residing on the rats that infested every nook and cranny of medieval towns, and those vendors working at ground level, surrounded by stagnant water, represented some of the most susceptible groups. Entire families of vendors perished in just a few days, leaving their stalls deserted and their goods to decay in the streets. Female vendors confronted additional health risks tied to their gender. Pregnancy and childbirth in these unsanitary environments posed significant dangers, with maternal and infant mortality rates reaching harrowing peaks. Women often gave birth in the very spaces where they sold food, assisted solely by other women lacking medical training. Postnatal infections were prevalent and frequently deadly, resulting in newborns left orphaned and older children forced to fend for themselves in an already unforgiving setting. The water utilized for cooking and food preparation consistently served as a source of contamination. Vendors selling ready-to-eat meals often had no option but to use whatever water was available, irrespective of its quality. Soups and porridge were made with water that had already made countless individuals ill, while bread was kneaded with hands that had never been adequately cleaned. The very act of preparing food for sale turned into a means of proliferating disease. Throughout the community, medical attention for vendors was virtually non-existent. Medical care was exclusively for the affluent, while barber surgeons, with their rudimentary grasp of anatomy and healing, remained financially inaccessible to the majority of vendors. When vendors encountered serious illness, they turned to traditional remedies passed down across generations. These treatments were often futile, and at times could even be detrimental. Numerous vendors tried to heal severe infections with poultices made from spoiled bread or animal excrement, inadvertently introducing further germs into their wounds. The psychological burden of existing in such an environment was staggering, though seldom recognized or comprehended during medieval times. The relentless worry over health, the daily barrage of overpowering smells and sights, and the awareness that any day could herald a plague capable of extinguishing entire families fostered a climate filled with anxiety and hopelessness. Vendors adopted a resigned perspective, viewing sickness and premature death as unavoidable realities rather than issues that could be prevented. For children born into vendor households, the outlook was particularly bleak. From birth, they were subjected to these dreadful sanitary conditions, with their still developing immune systems constantly besieged by pathogens. Many did not survive past their first year. Those who lived often exhibited lasting effects of malnutrition, and disease and illnesses that would be trivial by today's standards were fatal in the medieval context. Parents soon learned to avoid getting too attached to their youngest offspring, fully aware of the grim survival odds. The cyclical nature of vendor work led to fluctuating sanitary conditions throughout the year, though there was little improvement. Overall, warmer months intensified the heat, hastening the decay of refuse and food, thus amplifying foul odors and elevating the presence of disease-carrying insects. Winter offered some respite from flies and various pests, yet vendors had to cluster more closely for warmth, which accelerated the transmission of respiratory illnesses and other contagious diseases. In spite of these daunting obstacles, medieval street vendors demonstrated incredible resilience and developed adaptations to their circumstances. They became adept at identifying the early indicators of food spoilage and illness, honing their skills in assessing risks that were often beyond their complete understanding. These vendors formed close-knit communities, providing mutual assistance during periods of sickness, with healthier vendors looking after the children of ill colleagues and sharing resources whenever feasible. Such informal networks of care and cooperation frequently served as the only barrier standing between vendor families and utter poverty. The repercussions of these severe sanitary conditions reverberated well beyond the medieval era, influencing societal attitudes towards poverty, disease, and urban planning for many years thereafter. The link between poverty and disease became deeply entrenched in societal thought, fostering discrimination and marginalization that lingered long after the root causes were comprehended. The medieval street vendors, striving to survive in a milieu that would be deemed unlivable today, inadvertently contributed to patterns of urban development and public health policies that would shape city planning for generations to come. Through the lens of the sanitary challenges faced by these vendors, we observe not only individual hardship, but also a collective societal failure to provide fundamental protections for its most vulnerable constituents. These men, women, and children, who daily risked their well-being to supply food and goods to their communities, certainly deserved better than the atrocious conditions they faced. Their narratives serve as a reminder of the journey we've taken toward a better understanding of public health and sanitation, while also highlighting the grim reality of life when fundamental human necessities are overlooked or undervalued by authority figures. As I reference your script and previous materials, I'll now proceed from where you stopped, diving into Part 7. This segment will shed light on the daily survival challenges faced by street vendors in medieval times. The lives of these vendors were marked by critical choices that would seem unfathomable today. For instance, when Agnes the fishmonger found that half of her catch had spoiled overnight, she was confronted with a decision that epitomized the harshness of a vendor's life. She could throw away the questionable fish, sacrificing vital income that her family sorely needed, or she could disguise the spoilage using potent herbs, hoping her patrons would remain unaware until after payment. Ultimately, Agnes opted for survival over integrity, as many vendors did. She meticulously placed the fresher fish on the surface, concealed the questionable ones beneath, and generously sprinkled the entire lot with dried rosemary and thyme. The fragrant herbs would mask the odor sufficiently to facilitate a sale. This was a risky bet on her reputation, But when it came to her children's meals, reputation took a back seat. This ethical compromise exemplified just one of the numerous moral quandaries vendors encountered every single day. The distinction between survival and deceit became increasingly blurred when unsold goods equated to another night of hunger for their families. For example, Thomas the bread seller frequently added sawdust to his flour during difficult times, while Mary, the alewife, diluted her ale until it barely resembled the robust drink it once was. These acts were not necessarily indicative of dishonest character, but were rather desperate responses from individuals ensnared in a financial system that offered no safety nets for those who faltered. The physical strain associated with the life of a vendor went well beyond the clear challenges posed by the elements and the burden of heavy loads. The relentless anxiety of financial instability revealed itself in ways that those living in the medieval era could see, yet not fully comprehend. Vendors exhibited signs of aging far more rapidly, their faces marked by worry lines that narrated tales of sleepless nights spent worrying whether the sales of the next day would suffice to pay the rent. Hair turned grey prematurely, teeth deteriorated due to inadequate nutrition, and hands became gnarled from repetitive tasks and exposure to harsh weather. Margaret, the wool merchant, suffered from a chronic cough that plagued her frail physique every winter, a condition today acknowledged as chronic bronchitis, which stemmed from years of inhaling wool fibers and working in damp conditions lacking proper ventilation. In those times, such health issues were merely seen as the unavoidable byproduct of one's social standing. The mental strain was potentially more destructive than the physical challenges. Vendors existed in a state of constant watchfulness, ever aware of threats to their means of survival. A new vendor setting up nearby could mean disaster for established ones. Shifts in local regulations or taxes could instantly turn what had been a barely profitable venture into a surefire loss. The entrance of traveling merchants with better quality products could dismantle the clientele that local vendors had painstakingly cultivated over the years. This ongoing pressure fostered a community marked by deep connections yet fierce competition. Vendors would unite against outside challenges, such as aggressive tax collectors or antagonistic guild members, but would not hesitate to undercut one another when it came to their survival. Friendships forged through shared struggles could vanish at a moment's notice when one vendor prospered at the cost of another. The offspring of vendors inherited not only their parents' trades, but also their fears and survival tactics. These youngsters learned to deceitfully promote the quality of their merchandise, to identify potential troublemakers from afar in the marketplace, and to assess profit margins before they had fully mastered reading or writing. For vendor families, the concept of a carefree childhood was an unattainable luxury. Children as young as 5 or 6 were anticipated to play a significant role in the family's survival, whether through begging, stealing, or helping with transactions. Little Emma, daughter of a candle maker, devoted her days to dipping wicks in tallow, her fingers sore from the hot wax. She longed for the fresh bread she inhaled from the baker's stall each morning, fully aware that such treats were meant for their customers and not for vendor families perpetually teetering on the brink of poverty. Her schooling revolved around recognizing which clients paid on time and which necessitated assertive collection approaches, knowledge that would serve her well when she one day took over her parents' precarious trade. The seasonal fluctuations, inherent in many vendor operations, introduced further unpredictability. While summer might bring some financial relief for those selling fresh fruits or chilled drinks, winter could be catastrophic for vendors whose items were deemed non-essential. Ice vendors endured months of inactivity. Conversely, those providing warm meals might do well during chilly weather, but found it difficult to thrive in the summer months when appetites lessened and perishability increased. This seasonal volatility compelled vendors to devise intricate survival plans, necessitating strategic thinking akin to that of modern financial advisors. Although lacking formal training in relevant subjects, these vendors became adept at accumulating coins during prosperous months, adjusting their product offerings according to seasonal demand, and maintaining various revenue sources to navigate unavoidable downturns. A flourishing vendor might trade fruits in the summer, roasted chestnuts in winter, and undertake odd jobs during lulls in business. The absence of trustworthy storage options presented additional hurdles that today's vendors would struggle to comprehend. Operating without refrigeration, those selling perishable items lived under the constant threat of spoilage. They acquired a deep understanding of their product's shelf life, mastering the ability to spot the initial signs of decay that might go unnoticed by buyers. This knowledge, forged out of necessity, effectively made them novice food scientists, grasping concepts of preservation and spoilage long before these would be formally recognized. In spite of such overwhelming adversities, medieval street vendors showcased incredible resilience, finding moments of joy and camaraderie even within their unforgiving realities. Markets evolved into vibrant social centers where vendors exchanged insights on successful sales strategies, alerted one another to troublesome customers, and provided emotional support during especially tough times. These informal networks acted as a safety net, enabling vendors to weather personal crises. They cultivated their own folklore and customs that offered solace in their challenging lives. Tales of vendors overcoming remarkable challenges served as motivation during bleak periods, while shared traditions and celebrations fostered connections that transcended competition. Although modest in nature, market day festivities granted brief respites from the relentless grind of survival, reminding vendors of their place in a wider human community. Their resilience was perhaps most notably demonstrated by their unwavering hope for future generations. Even with a clear understanding of the difficulties associated with life as a vendor, parents persisted in teaching their children the trade, convinced that the skills and wisdom they imparted would ultimately lead to improved prospects. This enduring belief amidst substantial contrary evidence highlights the innate human ability to hope and the deep affection parents held for their children, even when their material offerings were minimal. The legacy of these medieval street vendors transcends their immediate historical period. Their challenges and adaptations formed the basis for contemporary commercial practices, labor rights, and social safety nets that we often take for granted today. Their narratives remind us that, at its core, commerce is tied to human survival, and the lengths individuals will go to support their families. By examining their harsh realities, we gain insight into our own economic interactions and the advantages we enjoy in today's economy. As we contemplate the lives of these overlooked entrepreneurs, we are reminded that every transaction, no matter how minor or insignificant it may seem, is underpinned by a human tale of struggle, tenacity, and aspiration. The medieval street vendors who advertised their products in marketplaces throughout Europe were not merely trading goods. They were battling for survival, dignity, and the opportunity to create a better future for the next generation. These vendors navigated a merciless economic system designed to crush their spirits. By the time we reach this juncture in our story, we've observed their daily fights against poverty, violence, and illness. Yet perhaps their most insidious adversary was the feudal framework itself, a rigid structure that ensnared them in cycles of exploitation, leaving little hope for liberation. The guild framework, which heavily influenced trade during medieval times, established a nearly impenetrable wall between street vendors and viable success. These influential associations dictated every detail of commerce, regulating everything from product quality to the maximum prices vendors could charge. Gaining entry into a guild demanded not merely expertise, but also hefty fees, political ties, and often ancestral connections reaching back many generations, a far-off dream for a street vendor merely trying to gather enough copper coins for tomorrow's stock. Membership in such guilds seemed as unattainable as the night sky. Master artisans closely guarded their techniques and jurisdictions. A vendor selling bread in proximity to a guild-affiliated bakery could easily find themselves accused of unfairly competing or offering substandard products. The repercussions were swift and severe: confiscation of merchandise, exorbitant fines, or even exile from the marketplace. Thomas the baker, whom we encountered earlier as he grappled with his stale loaves, learned this hard truth when guild inspectors discovered sawdust mixed into his flour. The resulting fine set him back 3 months' worth of earnings, money he was simply unable to afford. Beyond the reach of the guilds lay an even more stifling network of taxes and tributes. Vendors of the medieval streets faced an overwhelming multitude of fees and levies that seemed to proliferate like weeds after a downpour. There was a market fee for the privilege of selling in the town square, a bridge tax for entering more affluent areas, a cart fee for utilizing wheeled transport, and an endless array of charges that local authorities devised with inventive zeal. Take the case of Margaret, a widow selling herbs and remedies from a modest basket. Every morning she paid the market sergeant for her position near the church steps. If she attempted to move to attract more customers, she incurred additional fees to various ward officials. Additionally, when she bought her herbs from local farmers, she faced a gate tax upon entering the city, and if she needed to store goods overnight, there was a fee to the warehouse keeper. As she tallied all her expenses, her profit margin dwindled to nearly nothing. The unpredictable nature of these taxes rendered any form of planning futile. A vendor might show up at the market, only to find new charges enforced overnight, or learn that yesterday's authorized selling location was now off-limits. Officials whimsically altered regulations, often singling out vendors who seemed to be thriving. Success itself became a risk, as prosperity attracted the gaze of tax collectors, akin to carrying birds to a carcass. Local authorities exercised their power with arbitrary cruelty. The market bailiff might solicit bribes to ignore trivial violations, while the town watch extorted money for protection from vendors operating after sunset. Those unable to pay faced sudden confiscation of their goods or abrupt cancellation of their permits. Justice was reserved for those willing to pay for it, rendering street vendors defenseless against any petty official harboring a grudge or a financial shortfall. The church, despite its messages of goodwill and compassion, was equally voracious in its demands. Vendors were expected to make contributions for religious festivities, finance special masses, and support various initiatives by the local clergy. Failing to exhibit sufficient piety through generous offerings could lead to allegations of heresy or moral decay. In a time when suspicion of the religious kind could ruin lives, vendors had very few options but to pour their scant savings into the church's coffers. Even the physical marketplace worked against them. The most favorable selling locations near the cathedral entrance, close to main roads or sheltered under covered walkways, were allocated to established merchants who paid higher fees. Street vendors found themselves relegated to muddy corners, narrow alleys or exposed spaces where unfriendly weather could ruin their merchandise, and few customers dared to venture. These prime locations weren't merely about convenience, they were crucial for survival. A vendor positioned near the cathedral could engage parishioners before and after services when their hearts were open and their purses were ready. Those relegated to the outskirts of the market might spend entire days without encountering a single buyer, witnessing their perishable items decay while established merchants tallied their earnings. The fluctuating nature of street vending added further unpredictability to an already fragile livelihood. During summer, opportunities arose to sell fresh produce, chilled beverages, and festival items. However, this season also ushered in stiff competition from rural farmers inundating the markets with their yields. Winter diminished both supply and demand, as customers stayed indoors and goods became limited. Vendors were compelled to endure months of decreased revenue while still facing the same fees and taxes. Weather conditions constantly threatened their survival in ways that could not be entirely planned for. A sudden storm could ruin a day's stock, while prolonged rainfall could deter customers and spoil stored items. Snow could obstruct pathways, preventing vendors from accessing suppliers or reaching buyers. In the harshest winters, some vendors succumbed to the cold in their stalls, clutching onto goods they could never afford to leave behind. The legal system offered no safeguards for vendors wronged by customers or competitors. Courts typically favored those with wealth and influence, leaving street vendors with few options when deceived. A nobleman who took goods without remuneration could not be confronted by an ordinary vendor. Fellow vendors might lure away each other's customers through price undercutting or spreading damaging rumors, but lodging formal complaints required resources that were rarely available. Enforcing contracts was nearly unattainable for small vendors. Agreements with suppliers often depended on trust and handshakes, rendering vendors vulnerable if deliveries failed or goods turned out to be faulty. Lacking written contracts or legal aid, vendors had no means to reclaim losses or hold partners responsible. This unpredictability made it incredibly challenging to strategize for the future or to invest in expanding their businesses. Prejudice further exacerbated these economic difficulties. Street vendors were situated among the lowest tiers of medieval society. Viewed with mistrust and disdain by those in higher social standings, they were considered barely above the level of beggars. Their trade was tainted by associations with deceit, desperation, and ethical decay. This negative image hindered their ability to draw in customers, gain credit, or earn the respect crucial for forming business collaborations. The relentless battle for survival fostered an atmosphere of fierce competition among the vendors themselves. Instead of uniting against their mutual oppressors, they would often turn against one another, slashing prices, spreading falsehoods about competitors' products, or squabbling over prime selling locations. This infighting diminished their collective bargaining strength and made them more susceptible to exploitation by those in power and guilds. Access to credit was nearly impossible at fair rates. Moneylenders imposed exorbitant interest that could entrap vendors in cycles of debt lasting for generations. A vendor who borrowed funds for purchasing goods during difficult times could end up repaying 3 times the original sum, if repayment was even an option. Defaulting meant losing everything: stock, tools, and frequently even their homes. The absence of banking establishments or commercial insurance implied that every transaction was fraught with significant risk. Vendors had no means to safeguard themselves against theft, natural disasters, or financial downturns. A single poor day could wipe away weeks of diligent saving, while a series of unfortunate events could devastate families that had labored for generations to establish their small enterprises. Women vendors faced additional hurdles in this patriarchal society. They were often barred from specific types of trade, charged elevated fees for market access, or subjected to harassment that their male peers could typically avoid. Widows attempting to carry on their deceased husband's businesses often found themselves shut out from supplier networks or compelled to rely on male intermediaries who took considerable cuts from their earnings. The guild system's tight grip on skilled trades effectively meant that street vendors were relegated to selling essential items or second-hand goods. They couldn't match the quality or prestige of guild-protected craftsmen, which forced them to concentrate on volume and low pricing. This led to a detrimental cycle in which they had to exert more effort for slimmer margins, further complicating their ability to accumulate the capital necessary to improve their situations. Instead of encouraging innovation, the system actively stifled it. A vendor who unveiled a new product or refined a technique might face accusations of breaching guild privileges or deviating from established practices. Authorities tended to favor the stable tax income derived from traditional systems over the unpredictability innovation could introduce. This stagnation kept vendors ensnared in the same rudimentary survival tactics for generations. Transportation expenses efficiently consumed profits. Vendors journeying between markets encountered tolls at bridges, city entrances, and territorial borders. Those who remained in a single location lost chances to scout better prices or tap into different customer bases. Either choice imposed substantial financial strains that adept merchants could manage, but street vendors could not. The feudal system's focus on personal loyalty and obligation rather than commercial law further complicated vendors' lives. They might be obligated to supply free goods or services to local lords, engage in military campaigns, or contribute labor for public works. While these obligations were supposedly mutual, reciprocation in the form of genuine protection or aid was seldom forthcoming. Even achieving success came with its own set of risks. A vendor who succeeded in accumulating a small amount of wealth might become a target for theft, extortion, or fabricated legal issues aimed at confiscating their assets. Authorities frequently perceived successful vendors as a source of income rather than as vital contributors to the local economy, intensifying scrutiny and pressure as their earnings increased. The psychological burden of ongoing financial strain cannot be overlooked. Vendors existed in a state of constant worry, uncertain of when the next challenge would arise or if they would manage to overcome it. This anxiety impacted their health, family dynamics, and capacity for sound business judgment. Many turned to alcohol or other forms of escape, which further deteriorated their chances of prosperity. Despite these daunting obstacles, some vendors were able to establish small pockets of relative stability. They created informal support networks, exchanged information about market trends, and assisted each other during crises. These relationships, founded on mutual trust and shared experiences, provided the only dependable safety net accessible to them. The most successful vendors learned to navigate the intricate web of regulations and relationships that governed their environment. They built connections with sympathetic officials, devised ways to add value to guild members without direct competition, and earned reputations for integrity that drew loyal clientele. However, cultivating these strategies required years of effort and could be jeopardized by a single mistake or shift in local politics. Religious festivals and market fairs offered sporadic chances for substantial earnings, but also invited heightened competition and elevated fees. Vendors had to weigh the potential benefits against the expenses of preparation, travel, and premium market charges. Many placed their entire savings at stake on these events, hoping for windfall profits that would sustain them during tougher times. The seasonal movement of vendors in line with harvest seasons, celebrations, and trade routes brought forth its own unique set of obstacles. The act of traveling continuously was not only costly, but fraught with dangers. Conversely, remaining in a single spot often equated to settling for reduced earnings and restricted opportunities. Vendors faced a critical decision: to remain within the safety of well-known markets, or to pursue the potentially greater rewards that came with venturing into new regions. As we observe these vendors grappling with systemic oppression, we gain insight into how their daily challenges influenced not only their individual circumstances, but also the broader structure of medieval society. Their tenacity amidst such significant challenges reflects a resilience that was nothing short of heroic. In our next session, we will explore how some of these vendors resisted the forces stacked against them, and how their small acts of defiance laid the groundwork for economic transformations that would eventually reshape the medieval landscape. Medieval street vendors navigated a dangerous reality where their very survival hinged on not just selling their limited goods, but also on maneuvering through a complex maze of social hierarchies, guild politics, and fluctuating regulations. While we have examined their struggles with poverty, illness, and violence, there exists another dimension to their plight that unveils the intricate nature of their lives, the psychological strain of living on society's edges. The mental load these vendors bore was likely their heaviest burden. Picture waking up each day with the awareness that your mere existence in the marketplace was only marginally accepted. Street vendors operated within a legal grey area, neither completely embraced nor entirely outlawed. They served as the economic outcasts, fulfilling essential roles while facing disdain from the very individuals who depended on their services. This psychological pressure surfaced in various aspects of their daily existence. Numerous vendors developed a distinctive hunched stance, not solely due to the weight of their burdens, but also from the constant necessity to appear smaller and less intimidating to guild members and local authorities who might perceive their presence as a threat or an obstruction. They became adept at sensing the faint indicators of impending trouble. For example, observing the movement of a guild enforcer's hand toward his pouch as he counted bribes, or noticing how swiftly a crowd's tone could shift to hostility during lean times. This ongoing alertness was draining. To be successful, a vendor had to stay cognizant of multiple dangers at once: pickpockets targeting their meager earnings, rivals vying to undercut their prices, officials in search of justifications to impose fines, and customers who might claim they were given less change or poor quality goods. This heightened state of awareness often resulted in a chronic form of anxiety that infiltrated every facet of their lives. When they did manage to sleep, it was often restless and fleeting. Many vendors would get up before sunrise to claim the best-selling spots, while those offering prepared foods frequently toiled late into the night to ready themselves for the next day. The limited hours of respite were often disturbed by nightmares about losing their stock to thieves or facing permanent expulsion from their selling locations. The accompanying social isolation may have been even more detrimental than the physical labor. Street vendors found themselves stuck between social classes, too impoverished to mingle with established merchants, yet their commercial activities distanced them from the ordinary laborers and artisans who comprised their customer base. They were neither fully integrated into the merchant class nor entirely accepted by the working poor. This liminal existence fostered a deep sense of not belonging. Family dynamics were strained under these conditions. Vendor families often had to disperse during work hours, with children sent to beg or perform minor tasks while parents tended to their stalls. The ongoing strain of economic instability generated friction in households. Disagreements about financial priorities were frequent. Should they spend on higher quality goods that might draw in more customers, or should they tighten their belts in preparation for the inevitable tough times? Female vendors endured extra psychological strains beyond the standard difficulties. Of street selling, they had to manage unique vulnerabilities associated with being a woman in public spaces. They evolved intricate tactics to handle harassment, such as positioning themselves near safe havens and forming supportive networks with fellow vendors to provide help if necessary. Many adopted a defensive demeanor, becoming instinctively adept at warding off unwanted advances while still seeming approachable to potential buyers. The dynamics between street vendors and established guild merchants were particularly psychologically nuanced. Vendors often felt deep resentment toward guild members who appeared to live in comfort while they struggled for survival. Yet, this resentment was intertwined with envy and aspiration. Many vendors fantasized about the possibility of earning enough to gain entry into a guild. While such social advancement was exceedingly rare, this internal conflict was evident in their interactions with guild merchants and their customers. They needed to present themselves as respectful and submissive to individuals they often regarded as undeservedly affluent, all while trying to persuade these same individuals to choose their products over those from established shops. The cognitive dissonance of this daily balancing act took a toll on their mental well-being. Religious beliefs offered some psychological solace, but were complicated by the church's often conflicting teachings. Although Christianity advocated for the dignity of hard work and kindness toward the impoverished, street vendors were frequently perceived as morally questionable. The church's focus on established social hierarchies implied that the lowly status of vendors was divinely ordained, thereby amplifying the psychological struggles for those eager to improve their lives. To cope, some vendors turned to their own informal spiritual practices. They often carried small religious items or created personal rituals surrounding their work, such as blessing their goods at the beginning of each day or whispering prayers for safety and prosperity. These practices offered a sense of control and hope amid otherwise bleak circumstances. The psychological toll of continuous uncertainty cannot be overstated. Unlike artisans or laborers who might have some level of predictability regarding their jobs and income, street vendors existed in a constant state of instability. Variables like weather conditions, political unrest, religious celebrations, market regulations, seasonal changes, and many other influences could significantly impact their daily earnings. This precariousness made long-term planning nearly unfeasible and instigated a persistent worry about what lay ahead. Numerous vendors exhibited signs that we would now identify as chronic stress and depression. Historical accounts depict vendors becoming increasingly isolated, wary of others, and susceptible to sudden fits of rage or sorrow. The relentless battle for survival left scant mental resources for enjoyment, creativity, or personal development. The children of these street vendors were particularly influenced by these psychological strains. Growing up amidst perpetual stress and unpredictability, they frequently exhibited premature maturity and anxiety. Many learned to stifle their own needs and wants to prevent adding to their family's burdens. The psychological patterns formed during childhood often continued the cycle of marginalization into subsequent generations. Despite facing these daunting mental challenges, many vendors exhibited extraordinary resilience and developed adaptive strategies. They established informal support systems, exchanging insights on market conditions, alerting one another to potential dangers, and occasionally pooling their resources during particularly challenging times. These bonds, formed through shared adversity, often provided authentic emotional support and a sense of community. Some vendors discovered ways to uphold their dignity and self-worth even while facing marginalization. They might focus on specific products or cultivate a reputation for honesty and fair practices that instilled pride in their work. Others turned to humor as a survival tactic, honing their wit and storytelling abilities to amuse customers while also offering a psychological escape from everyday pressures. The mental strain of medieval street vending went beyond individual hardship. It had repercussions for entire communities. The existence of many financially desperate and psychologically stressed individuals created underlying social strains that could boil over in times of crisis. Food riots, uprisings against authority, and religious movements often thrived within groups that included numerous marginal vendors and traders. Yet, perhaps most notably, a great many of these vendors held on to hope in spite of their situations. They persisted in their belief that diligence, ingenuity, and perseverance could eventually lead to better circumstances. This hope, albeit delicate, was vital for their mental endurance and stands as one of the most commendable aspects of their tenacity. Their psychological struggles serve as a reminder that economic marginality has always encompassed more than just material hardship. The emotional and mental toll of living on the fringes of society, the stress, solitude, uncertainty, and loss of dignity, were arguably the most significant burdens faced by these medieval street vendors. Their narratives highlight the profound human costs associated with economic disparity and social exclusion. Lessons that continue to hold significance in recognizing marginalized communities throughout history and even today. Part 10. The harsh truths of making a living on the streets. As the first light illuminated the bustling medieval marketplace, street vendors emerged from whatever scant shelter they had managed to secure for the night. This could have been a doorway shared with vermin and refuse, or a corner sheltered beneath a merchant stall where the wind was less biting against their tattered cloaks. For these overlooked individuals, each dawn brought the same unyielding battle: to gather enough copper coins to endure another day in a world seemingly structured to oppress them. The hierarchy within street trading was as rigid and relentless as any feudal arrangement. At the pinnacle were the established guild merchants, with their stone storefronts and royal licenses, their wealth in silver, and their bellies full. Just below them were the licensed traders, who paid substantial fees to set up permanent stalls in the more desirable sections of the marketplace. However, at the very bottom, struggling in the shadows and fringes, were the unlicensed vendors, men, women, and children who sold whatever they could find, create, or pilfer, just to secure a morsel of bread. These desperate individuals encountered hostility from all sides. The guild merchants regarded them as unfair competition, undermining their prices with inferior products. The licensed traders viewed them as leeches, drawing undesirable customers while driving away reputable buyers. The city officials saw them as at best a nuisance and at worst criminals, facing arbitrary fines, confiscation of their goods, and violent removal from prime selling spots. Margaret the ragwoman was acutely aware of this harsh reality. For 15 years, she roamed the narrow lanes of London with a canvas sack draped over her hunched shoulders, calling out in a voice shaped by years of shouting, "Rags! Old rags! A fair coin for your discards." Her gnarled fingers, permanently stained dark from handling endless soiled fabrics, would sift through the affluent's tossed-away garments, on the lookout for pieces that could be cleaned, repaired, and sold to those a notch less desperate than herself. The labor was grueling and demeaning. Margaret would dedicate hours hunched over rain barrels, scrubbing blood, vomit, and far worse from clothing worn by plague sufferers, executed felons, or simply the unbathed throngs. The odor enveloped her like a second skin, branding her as pariah in a society already divided by scent. Upstanding citizens would take a wide berth to avoid her, shielding their noses with perfumed cloths, as though her mere existence might spoil them. Yet even this humiliating toil was rife with rivalry and peril. Other rag-pickers would clash fiercely over the contents of a promising refuse pile, scratching and clawing each other for the opportunity to snatch a moth-eaten tunic or a pair of shoes with soles barely intact. Margaret bore the evidence of numerous such skirmishes, a lost tooth from an encounter with Agnes the Shrew, who had struck her with a wooden implement, and a perpetual limp from being shoved down a stone staircase while escaping with an armful of pilfered rags. The authorities showed little mercy to those involved in such conflicts. When the watch discovered two rag women vying for a heap of cast-offs, their typical response was to seize everything, throw both women into stocks for a day and night, and caution that further offences would lead to branding or banishment. There was no recourse, no consideration of their circumstances, no acknowledgement that these women were fighting for their very existence. For those vendors who succeeded in gathering a modest inventory to sell, the daily grind was marked by relentless vigilance and overwhelming anxiety. They needed to wake up before sunrise to secure the choice locations, typically where foot traffic was most significant, but not yet dominated by guild merchants and licensed traders. This often meant setting up shop near church entrances right as morning prayers concluded, or at crossroads where rural folks arrived in the city with their carts full of produce. Yet even nabbing a prime spot was merely the start of their struggles for the day. Street vendors had to remain ready to retreat at a moment's notice when guild enforcers or city officials conducted their inspections. Some fortunate vendors might get a brief heads-up from compassionate passers-by or fellow vendors who had noticed the approaching authorities. In contrast, the unfortunate ones would see their scant goods strewn in the mud, trampled underfoot by those who took pleasure in dismantling the livelihoods of those who couldn't fight back. Old Henrik, the pie seller, had mastered the technique of quick escape. His wooden cart had leather straps that enabled him to throw it over his back like a heavy pack, allowing him to transition from a stationary vendor to a fleeing refugee in seconds. He had memorized every alley, every concealed courtyard, and every loose plank in every fence that could serve as an escape route when the authorities arrived. His meat pies, if the grey chewy filling could truly be referred to as meat, were barely edible. Nevertheless, Henrik had managed to thrive in this business for over 2 decades, relying on his cleverness and deep understanding of the urban landscape. The ongoing strain of this cat-and-mouse existence deeply impacted the vendor's physical and mental well-being. Many developed nervous habits, perpetually scanning for signs of imminent trouble. Others became increasingly paranoid and suspicious, viewing every customer as a potential informant and every fellow vendor as a rival to be eliminated. The fortunate ones simply became desensitized to the daily indignities, their spirits battered into a state of muted acceptance that enabled them to endure but never truly thrive. Sleep was a rare luxury that few street vendors could afford. Those lacking family or friends to offer shelter would spend their nights crammed into doorways beneath bridges or within the remnants of forsaken buildings. When possible, they slept in shifts, taking turns to keep watch for thieves, rapists, or simply other desperate individuals who might take their few belongings. The winter months were especially harsh, with frostbite claiming fingers and toes, and pneumonia ruthlessly taking the weak and elderly. Even those who were lucky enough to have some form of shelter faced persistent uncertainty. Landlords who rented space to the impoverished demanded exorbitant prices for hovel-like accommodations that decent people wouldn't even house their animals in. A single room could be shared by a dozen or more individuals, with straw pallets being swapped in shifts to ensure that bodies were always filling every available inch. Privacy was a rarity, sanitation was rudimentary at best, and disease spread through these tight confines like wildfire. Young Thomas the apple boy had internalized these brutal truths at the tender age of 7, when his father succumbed to the sweating sickness, and his mother was compelled to send him to the streets to fend for himself. The boy would position himself near the cathedral steps, with a small basket of bruised apples, rescued from farmers unable to sell their damaged wares to customers with higher standards. His high-pitched cry echoing sweet apples fresh from the orchard was a falsehood that everyone recognized but few challenged. The apples were not sweet or fresh, yet they were inexpensive. And in a world where hunger was a constant presence, even bruised fruit could find buyers. Thomas quickly realized that thriving in the street vending business relied little on the quality of what one sold and everything on understanding people and their circumstances. He could identify a prospective customer from 50 paces away. Their gait, the style of their clothing, and the expressions they wore all offered hints regarding their willingness to buy and their capacity to pay. More crucially, he became adept at spotting the various threats that roamed the streets. The guild enforcers clad in leather jackets and armed with sturdy clubs, the city watch distinguished by their steel helmets and intimidating demeanor, and the older street youths who might attempt to snatch his basket and earnings. The boy also realized that evoking pity could serve as a potent sales tactic. His naturally slight frame and emaciated look made him appear even younger than he truly was, prompting many customers to buy his subpar apples simply out of sympathy. Thomas learned to highlight his poverty and fragility, affecting a slight limp and using a voice that quavered from genuine hunger. It was a demeaning act, yet it delineated the line between having enough to eat or facing starvation. Nonetheless, even the power of pity had boundaries. During particularly tough times when food was scarce, competition among child vendors turned cutthroat. Thomas bore scars from encounters with other needy children who had attempted to steal his spot or his meager income. He had a broken nose from 8-year-old Sarah, the baker's daughter, who hit him with a stone when he refused to give up his position near the church's entrance. A jagged scar etched across his forearm was a reminder of the encounter with 12-year-old Will, the pie seller, who sliced him with a rusty blade during a squabble over a fallen penny. The adult sellers offered scant protection or camaraderie to these young competitors. Many of them begrudged the children for their ability to draw sympathy and for being willing to toil for lesser profits. An adult vendor might need to earn 6p to secure a night's lodging and a bowl of thin stew, while a child could scrape by on just 2p worth of stale bread and a corner to sleep in. This economic landscape fostered deep-seated divisions within an already marginalized community, turning potential allies against one another in a desperate fight for survival. The authorities took full advantage of these rifts, manipulating them without mercy. City officials incentivized vendors with meager rewards for reporting on their rivals, a handful of copper coins for exposing unlicensed transactions, a bowl of soup for revealing the whereabouts of stolen items, a cozy night in a warm cell rather than the stocks in exchange for intel on planned gatherings or protests. Such strategies cultivated an atmosphere thick with mistrust and betrayal, making organized resistance nearly unattainable. Yet within this grim reality, fleeting moments of genuine compassion occasionally flickered like tiny candle flames in the encompassing darkness. When old Henrik collapsed from exhaustion during a particularly sweltering summer, it was his fellow vendors who helped him to a shaded spot and shared their precious water with him. When young Thomas was assaulted and robbed by a group of older boys, Margaret the ragwoman utilized her scant earnings to buy him bread and nurse his wounds. Although these acts of kindness were infrequent and modest, they embodied the stubborn endurance of human decency under circumstances designed to dismantle it. The vendors also established their own unwritten codes of conduct and mutual safeguards. Specific selling locations were generally recognized as being owned by particular individuals. Although these territorial claims held no legal weight, they were generally honored within the vendor community. Information about the authorities' movements was communicated openly through intricate systems of signals and warnings that could clear a street of unlicensed traders in minutes. If one vendor was arrested or expelled, others might pool their resources to help their family weather the storm until they could return or secure alternative support. These networks of communal aid were delicate and persistently tested by the strains of survival. Trust was a rarity that few could afford, and the lure of betrayal was ever present when starvation loomed. Yet they carried on, forming perhaps the only viable means of social structure available to those marginalized by guilds, churches, and other formal institutions of medieval life. The seasonal patterns of that era posed further obstacles for street vendors. Summer brought a surge in trade as people ventured outdoors more frequently and farmers delivered fresh produce to the markets. However, it also invited competition from rural individuals who could sell genuinely fresh goods at lower prices than urban vendors. Autumn represented a time of preparation, as vendors hurried to gather warm clothing and preserved foods in anticipation of the approaching winter. Winter itself demanded resilience, with only the most tenacious and adaptable vendors managing to stay in business, while many others were merely aiming to survive until spring. Spring heralded renewal, but also urgency, as vendors emerging from the winter, often weak and drained, faced intense rivalry for the revitalized opportunities that warmer months provided. This cycle was harsh and relentless, with each season introducing its unique set of difficulties. Throughout these challenges, street vendors held on to their humanity through stories, songs, and shared memories. During the few safe moments they could convene, they recounted tales of better times, performed folk songs that connected them to their shared humanity, and exchanged gossip and information that aided in maneuvering through their perilous environment. These oral traditions not only entertained, but also served as a form of cultural resistance, upholding values of dignity, community, and hope amidst conditions aimed at eroding them. Medieval street vendors were not simply economic participants, striving to exist in a brutal marketplace. They were individuals cast to the fringes of society, yet steadfastly clinging to their humanity. Their narratives remind us that even in the bleakest situations, people discover means to uphold their dignity, provide support to one another, and resist forces that attempt to turn them into mere objects of exploitation. Their existence was undeniably challenging to an extent that we today find hard to fathom. Nevertheless, it was also interspersed with instances of bravery, compassion, and relentless determination that exemplify the unyielding strength of the human spirit. By reflecting on their trials, we not only honor their legacy, but also our collective humanity and our responsibility to forge a world wherein such dire circumstances are no longer a necessity for survival. In Part 11, we delve into the grim realities faced by medieval street vendors. Amid their battles with corrupt officials and financial struggles, perhaps their most daunting challenge was the threat of disease and medical crises that could obliterate their already fragile livelihoods. In a time devoid of modern healthcare, even a small ailment could lead to financial disaster for a vendor reliant on daily sales for survival. The bubonic plague, which repeatedly ravaged Europe during the medieval era, posed the greatest disaster for street vendors. When the plague struck a town, commerce came to a standstill almost instantaneously. Markets were deserted, patrons fled or succumbed to illness, and vendors who had risked their scant savings on perishable items helplessly witnessed their stock decay as unsold. For those vendors who managed to weather the initial outbreak, they often found themselves in communities where half of the populace had been lost, resulting in far fewer customers who had disposable income. In addition to the major plagues, everyday health issues continually threatened vendors' survival. A baker who injured his arm could not knead dough, and a fishmonger suffering from dysentery couldn't reach the docks. A cloth merchant whose eyesight deteriorated after years spent working by candlelight might become unable to identify quality fabrics. Unlike skilled artisans, who often had helpers or relatives to support them, street vendors generally operated solo and lacked any sort of safety net when they fell ill. The filthy conditions of medieval cities made transmission of diseases unavoidable for these vendors. They labored near open sewers, decaying refuse, and tainted water sources. Food vendors, in particular, were at greater risk due to the nature of their products, which attracted rats, flies, and other disease carriers. The very congested market environments that were crucial for making sales also served as ideal breeding grounds for contagions. Traditional medical knowledge during the medieval period provided little assistance for ailing vendors. Most couldn't afford the care of trained physicians who primarily catered to the affluent. Instead, they often turned to folk cures, herbal remedies from local healers, or the questionable services of itinerant quack doctors selling miraculous treatments. Many vendors resorted to self-medication using whatever affordable ingredients they could find, frequently yielding disastrous outcomes. When serious illness struck, families of these vendors faced harrowing decisions. Should they keep the business open, despite the potential risk of spreading illness to customers? Should they close temporarily and experience a critical loss of income? Should they sell their remaining stock at low prices to afford treatment? Such choices often dictated whether a vendor's family would endure or become another among the countless destitute beggars on medieval streets. The emotional burden of constant exposure to mortality and sickness took a heavy toll on medieval street vendors. They observed the anguish of their patrons, neighbors, and rivals daily. Funerals were a common occurrence in medieval towns, and vendors frequently found themselves selling goods to families preparing to inter their deceased loved ones. This persistent reminder of our mortality fostered a climate of unease and despair that infiltrated the vendor community. To fend off illness, some vendors resorted to superstitions. They might don amulets, recite prayers over their goods, or refuse to serve clients who looked unwell. Others sought solace in alcohol to handle the pressure and anxiety, though this often resulted in poor decision-making and financial troubles. The economic ramifications of disease rippled far beyond personal illness. During outbreaks of plague or other epidemics, whole supply chains disintegrated. Farmers halted their deliveries of produce, artisans ceased their work, and trade routes became deserted. Vendors with established relationships with dependable suppliers suddenly found themselves without goods to offer. Those who had given credit to buyers often realized that their debtors had perished, taking their chances of repayment with them. Illness also unsettled the informal networks essential for vendors' survival. When disease struck, the collaborative agreements between vendors frequently unraveled. A vendor who had pledged to oversee a neighbor's stall might evacuate the city to escape infection. Suppliers who had previously provided goods on credit could demand immediate payment, fearing their clients might not be around to pay later. The social connections that held the vendor community together often disintegrated under the strain of the spreading illness. The children of vendor families were especially susceptible to the health crises that plagued medieval towns. Alarmingly high rates of infant mortality meant many families lost multiple children before they reached adulthood. Those who did survive frequently dealt with malnutrition and stunted growth, rendering them less capable of assisting in the family business. Parents faced the agonizing dilemma of whether to adequately nourish their children or maintain enough capital to sustain their businesses. The limited medical support accessible to vendors was frequently more harmful than beneficial. Bloodletting, the predominant medical practice of the time, often left patients who were already undernourished even weaker. While herbal remedies had their moments of success, they were just as likely to be toxic, particularly when handled by novices. When surgery was attempted, it was done without anesthesia or any understanding of sterile practices, resulting in high infection and mortality rates. Some vendors sought to broaden their business scope as a safeguard against the financial downfall brought on by illness. For instance, a cloth merchant might also sell preserved items that would last if he fell ill and couldn't work for several days. A baker could train his wife and children in his craft, allowing them to keep the business running should he fall sick. Nonetheless, these efforts were constrained by the limited scale of most vendors' operations and the insufficient capital necessary to manage multiple product lines. While religious beliefs offered some solace to vendors facing the relentless threat of disease, they also imposed additional strains. Many held the view that illness was a divine retribution for sins, which gave rise to feelings of guilt and shame. Others allocated vital resources for religious gifts and pilgrimages, hoping to earn divine protection. The Church's doctrine on accepting suffering as divine will sometimes dissuade vendors from pursuing medical care or preventive strategies. The susceptibility of street vendors to illness had enduring repercussions on medieval urban society. The frequent fatalities among vendors disrupted local food distribution networks and led to periodic shortages of vital goods. The continual fluctuation in the vendor population stymied the establishment of stable commercial relationships and inhibited the development of more advanced trade networks. The apprehension surrounding contagion further intensified social biases against vendors, who were frequently accused of disseminating disease due to their movement and interactions with various communities. In spite of these daunting obstacles, numerous medieval street vendors demonstrated astonishing fortitude amidst health crises. They devised effective tactics to reduce their risk of disease exposure, such as steering clear of certain city areas. During outbreaks or engaging in trade exclusively with reliable customers, they organized mutual aid groups that offered essential care for ill members and assistance to the families of those who passed away. When circumstances shifted, they adjusted their business practices by transitioning to goods that had longer shelf lives or were more sought after during periods of crisis. The struggle with disease and medical emergencies among medieval street vendors highlights the precariousness of existence at the fringes of medieval society. These individuals perpetually teetered on the brink of disaster, where a single illness had the potential to obliterate years of meticulous planning and labor. Their challenges reveal the stark truths of urban life during an era characterized by rudimentary medical understanding and virtually non-existent social safety nets. Nevertheless, their determination in the face of such formidable challenges underscores the intrinsic human impulse to endure and care for one's family, even in the harshest of circumstances imaginable. Part 12. The Enduring Legacy. In spite of the oppressive tribulations that marked their lives, the medieval street vendors of Scotland and throughout Europe imprinted a lasting legacy on history. Their narrative transcends mere suffering. It embodies a deep human resilience that laid the groundwork for our contemporary world. These overlooked merchants, who peddled their scant goods amidst muddy lanes and bustling markets, were unknowing trailblazers of commerce. Lacking formal education or influential backers, these vendors established the initial trade networks that gradually transformed into the complex market systems we recognize today. Their rudimentary stalls and urgent negotiations set the stage for the development of merchant guilds, banking systems, and global trade routes. The impact of street vendors can still be seen in the vibrant markets of cities all over the globe. From the Borough Market in London to the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul, the essence of those medieval sellers resonates through the ages. Their successors continue to learn how to organize, advocate for equitable treatment, and secure their rightful position within the economic framework of society. Remarkably, these vendors demonstrated an entrepreneurial spirit that could not be dampened by poverty or oppression. In a time when many were tied to the land or confined to inherited trades, street vendors opted for freedom and movement rather than stability. They took significant risks in pursuit of better lives, reminding us that commerce and ambition can thrive even in the bleakest periods. Their narrative serves as a reminder that beneath every statistic of medieval hardship were real people with aspirations and an unwavering resolve to endure. By honoring their legacy, we celebrate not only their struggles, but also their victories against seemingly insurmountable challenges.